All right, so we are at a crossroads today, right? The Christian faith, this whole Jesus Christ guy. Like, can I trust him? Can I trust the Gospels that were written about his life and his death and his resurrection? Are these actually reliable documents that I can read with some integrity? Well, I don't know, man. Let's take a look. So trust, man. I mean, that's what this life's all about, right? I mean, obviously in an eternal sense, but even in just an earthly sense, it's like, man, trust. You can't have anything without trust. And so when it comes to the Gospels, right, when it comes to that eternal playground, can we trust these documents? Like, are they reliable? That's kind of what I want to talk about here today. I mean, we've got the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so these are four unique interpretations of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that are effectively forming the basis of the Christian faith. Can we trust these guys? Well, my name is Jim Schultz here for the F Cubed podcast and livefcubed.com, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. And as a Christian, I'm clearly going to be a little biased with my presentation this afternoon, but hopefully it will be at least a little grounded in some very solid, strong, potent Wikipedia research. And so these four accounts, right, these four gospel documents, they're basically trying to accomplish two separate things at the same time. Number one, they want to report what happened, right? Like, they want to report as historical fact. Like, this is what happened. Like, this is what we saw. This is what happened. This is what we are going to record. They wanted to report the message of Jesus as Messiah. Now, what's interesting about Jesus Christ, his title is Christ, right? It's not his last name. Like, he's not Mr. Christ, right? That is his title, right? That is of the utmost respect in its form on his name. It is the title of, I believe this is in the Greek, of the Anointed One. And so Jesus Christ, right? The Anointed One, the King, the Messiah. And so that brings us to the second point, the second purpose of the four Gospels. And I've got to throw a quick shout out to my boys over at the Bible Project, because I'll link to them down in the show notes. Those guys are phenomenal. Like, you got to listen to these guys, and I'm ripping this off straight from them. They are the ones that kind of, opened my eyes to this idea. They're like, hey, listen, the Gospels are historical reporting. We got that. But there's a second element here that you have to be really clear about. The Gospels, they're not pulling any punches. They're not trying to hide the fact that they are forcing you to take a side, right? They are making a claim about Mr. Christ, right? They are making a claim about Jesus as the King, the Anointed One, the Messiah. And so after you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, any of the four or all four, you effectively have to reckon with that claim. You have to think through it for yourself and decide, all right, is what they're saying here true? Like, do I believe that this actually happened? Like, roll up your sleeves, do your research, hop on Wikipedia yourself, right? And then you've got to figure out, you've got to answer to this claim. You've got to, you got to be on one side of the fence. He either is or he isn't, right? It's really difficult to find a middle ground, right? Like, yes, you could say he's a great teacher, he's this, he's that, but at the end of the day, you have to decide he either is the Messiah or he isn't the Messiah. So, all right. So what I want to talk about here today is if you can trust these recorded documents. This is a pretty important question, man. This is a really important question. I mean, we talked about back in episode 152, I have down here in my notes. Can you trust Jesus himself? Right? So we talked about that. We talked about the man, the legend, right? Jesus Christ. Can you trust him? Well, we made the case that you could. We made the case that you absolutely could, but that's going to be a very different discussion from what we're going to talk about here today. Definitely go down in the show notes and, check out the episode 152 where we talked about can you trust Jesus. I think this was before I started doing these video podcasts too, so if you are on YouTube, you will find the audio version of episode 152 over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and Pocket Guard or Pocket Cast, whatever. You'll find it on your favorite podcast player. It should be everywhere. If my assistant, which is also me, knows what he's doing, it should be everywhere. But to go any further with your faith, to go any further with the reckoning of this claim, right? You gotta say, all right, can I trust Jesus? Okay, we try to talk about that in 152. But now here today, I've got these 4 documents that are recording, his life, his death, his resurrection. Can I trust these guys? Right? Like, are these guys reliable sources of information? That's what I want to talk about here today. If I'm really going to consider giving my life to Christ, I've got to know that I can trust these documents. So what I want to do here today is we're going to make the case that you can trust the gospel. And we're going to make the case that you can trust the gospel, the message, or the gospels, the 4 documents, from 2 different angles. The timing of them and the very nature of eyewitness accounts. So that's where we're headed. All right, so let's talk about the timing element of the Gospels and when they were written. We're going to kind of work backwards from some known events using some inferences and some logical deductive reasoning. So the timing of the Gospels, there's some debate, out there, especially in the non-Christian circles. There's some debate over when the Gospels were actually recorded. But we have some clues as to when they likely were. So follow me through this timeline. This is something that I kind of patched together in getting ready for, the show here today. So keep in mind, for reference, Jesus died in AD 33. So that's really important, right? He died in AD 33. So the first 3 Gospels, and possibly also the 4th, they were written while the city of Jerusalem was still standing. Right, this is pretty clear from the scriptures, from the content that is inside of the Gospels. Each of the first 3 Gospels contains predictions by Jesus himself concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. If you look at Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, those are all going to give you some indications of these predictions. But here's what's interesting. None of the Gospels record the fulfillment of that destruction. Now let's just pause for just a quick, brief hot second, right? This is Jerusalem, right? This isn't BFE. This isn't the boonies, right? Like, this is the city where everything went down. If that city had been destroyed while the Gospels were being written, or after, if the city had already been destroyed when the Gospels were indeed documented, you can bet your bottom biscuit that they would have written this down, right? You can bet, everything you've got that this would have been recorded in the content, but it's not there, right? So that gives us some indication that, all right, Jerusalem must have still been standing when the Gospels were written. Okay, so let's go forward. Well, we know that Titus destroyed the city, Titus the Roman, destroyed the city and the temple in AD 70. So that gives us kind of a clear timeline with some endpoints, right? Jesus died on 33. Titus destroys the city in 70. Or maybe it's that way, depending on how you're watching this. But either way, there's 2 endpoints of the spectrum, okay? All right, so AD 70 is when Jerusalem is taken down. So the composition of the first 3 Gospels most likely occurred sometime before this event, right? So that puts us within 40 years of Jesus' death. Okay, the fact that all 4 Gospels were written from the perspective of Jerusalem still being standing gives us pretty clear evidence that they were constructed prior to AD 70. And this is a time when both believers and non-believers were very much alive. I mean, much like we have today in 2020. But there were people there that obviously claimed to have seen the risen Christ, and there were people there that would call them out on that. They were highly skeptical of that even being possible, let alone having had happened. And so all these people were still alive. And so you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, possibly John, running around saying, all right, this is what happened, right? Well, there were people there that could have challenged that. There were people there that could have absolutely challenged that, since those documents were recorded as historical fact. And so the fact that they made it as far as they did, especially in a time, and I don't want to go off on this tangent because it's not related to what we're talking about here today. And you guys know me, man. I find me a rabbit hole. I love me a rabbit hole. But at that time, it's not like Christianity was popular, right? It's not like Christianity was the chalk, right? Like, Christianity was not very popular. Christianity it led to persecution. it led to martyrdom pretty much across the board, right? So let's keep that in mind too. Okay, if we look at the book of Acts, so let's add another layer of interesting evidence on top of this. If we look at the book of Acts was the second book written by Luke. There is some internal evidence from Acts that it should be dated before the death of Paul, because Paul's death is not recorded in Acts. And you would imagine that, again, if Paul had died, an extremely influential figure in the church at that time, and of course today still, it would have been recorded in Acts. And so the fact that it wasn't recorded, it's like, all right, Acts was probably written before Paul died, which was AD 68. So now we're before AD 68. Another thing that's interesting is, so let's say right now we're in the early to mid AD 60s. If we look at Luke uses Mark as a reference in some of his writings. So, well, it's not clear that this absolutely happened, but it looks to be possible. Let's go with that. Let's soften our stance a little bit. It looks possible that Luke may have used Mark as a reference, and I didn't do a good job of writing down any of the verses. I had them on some chicken scratch notes around here, but if you guys could see around me, you guys would be like, yeah, it all makes sense why he doesn't have it at hand right now. But it looks to be possible that Luke may have used Mark as a reference. So that would put, the Gospel of Mark before the early AD 60s. So now what do we have? We have the Gospels, the first Gospel, Mark, being written within 3 decades of Jesus' death. His life, his death, his resurrection. That's pretty close proximity to the actual event. So the very timing of when these Gospels were written, man, that's pretty powerful stuff. So yeah, man, from a recency standpoint, these documents were written just shortly after Jesus' death, when the events were just fresh in everyone's minds. And so, the naysayers of Christianity, to push this point a little further, because I think it is important. So we are going to go down this rabbit hole now that I've thought about it for a couple of seconds. The naysayers were quite prevalent. They could have easily dismissed everything that was written if it wasn't recorded correctly. Right? If it wasn't recorded correctly and accurately, they could have easily dismissed it, because they were quite numerous in terms of the non-believers, right? And you got to cut them some slack. It's like, man, this is crazy, right? This dude rose from the dead and he was walking around. It's crazy, right? It would kind of be like, so I graduated in 1999 at Notre Dame Harper Woods, all Catholic boys school down there in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. I graduated in 1999. The school is gone. It disappeared. I can't remember exactly, 2007, 8, 9, something like that. It's gone. But all my boys that I graduated with, they're not gone. They're still around, right? So it would kind of be like, this 1999, it's 2020, it's 21 years later. So the Gospels were only written a few years after, relative to our current example. It would be like my trying to write up some story about Notre Dame that wasn't actually true. I just whip up a bunch of garbage that I want to try to push my agenda. Well, what's going to happen once that hits the airwaves? My boys are all going to call me on that. Now, yes, in the first century, they didn't have Twitter. They didn't have Instagram stories. So it might take a little longer, right, to call people on it. But the same thing is going to absolutely happen. It's like, no, that's total garbage. That is not correct. If I tried to do that about Notre Dame, my boys would absolutely call me on that. So it's the same thing here, right? The non-believers would have never let that fly. They would have absolutely never let that, hit the presses, if you will. And so, from a recency standpoint, the timing of things really, really helps. But also, the timing, again, this is not exactly a popular belief, right? Jesus' death, his resurrection. Christianity was not on anyone's radar, right? It's brand new. Normally, in that time, if I'm not mistaken, which I definitely could be, I'm just kind of a regular dude trying to figure this stuff out. But normally, belief systems, like organized religions, they had to go through a long process to become established, right? They had to be vetted, right? They had to be respected. They had to have a little street cred. And Christianity just pops onto the scene because you got a bunch of dudes walking around and women walking around saying, I saw it. I saw it. He was dead and now he's alive. I saw it with my own 2 eyes. I touched his hands. I put my finger through the hole. I did all that stuff, right? And so it's no, I believe. I don't care if we don't have any standard operating procedures for this religion. I don't care if there isn't, a guide or a manual that I'm supposed to follow to be welcomed into this, this group. It doesn't matter. I believe because I saw it. And so it's like, man, that's pretty crazy. And the religious leaders at the time, they didn't like this, man. They didn't like this at all because it really rattled the cages. It really shook up the whole little system that they had going on, right? And so the gospel writers, what they were proposing, the claim that they were making, not exactly popular, right? The stance that they were taking, not exactly welcomed by the powers that be at that time. And so, in fact, to my knowledge, I think that all of the gospel writers and even the disciples, they were martyred for their faith, except for maybe John. I think John maybe died of natural causes out on, I think, Patmos Island after he wrote the book of Revelation. And so 11 out of 12 disciples, 3 out of 4 gospel writers martyred for their faith, killed for what they believe. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but if I have a toothache, I have a hard time doing something. These guys were killed for what they believe. I mean, let that sink in for a second. So, I mean, I don't know, man. For that reason alone, like, I think we could stop the podcast right here. Like, we're not going to. We're going to press on because I got like 19 more minutes I want to share with you guys. But I think we can stop right now. We got a pretty strong case for the reliability of the Gospels. Now, again, you've still got to reckon with the claim, right? And that's not really my purpose here today. We're just really focusing on the reliability of the documents themselves. But, man, I think we got a little something. All right, so that's the timing angle of this whole argument, this whole discussion. Let's talk about the eyewitness nature of these accounts. And this is an interesting little subject because I always hear this point challenged by non-Christians, by skeptics, by non-believers. And I'm actually going to turn it around today, and I'm going to propose that those tiny little differences that you see in the Gospels that a lot of non-believers like to point out as being evidence for their unreliability, I'm actually going to posit that they make them more reliable. So to do that, I'm going to lean on my man J. Warner Wallace over at Cold Case Christianity. I've talked about this guy before. He's really cool. Just a really, really cool guy. Really great idea. He used to be, or still is, a homicide detective, and he uses his investigative skills and abilities to basically, investigate the claims of the gospel. And I love it, right? I think it's really, really interesting and unique, and I think it's really, really cool. So anyway, so one of the things that he said, he's dealt with eyewitness testimony his whole career for decades and decades. So if anyone's going to comment on this, it's going to be him. He's actually said that eyewitness testimony is never identical. Never identical. The small discrepancies between the guy, in fact, you don't even want them to be identical. Because if they were identical, then it's like, all right, are these really authentic? Like, can I really trust these? Right? Like, if you step onto a murder scene and you got 5 eyewitnesses and they all saw the exact same thing, right? Are those really authentic perspectives, unique perspectives? Or what most likely happened? Well, they all got together, they got their story straight, and they're just regurgitating the same story 5 times. You're not getting 5 unique perspectives of what actually happened. So you may not be able to figure out what actually happened because you're only getting one version 5 times instead of 5 unique versions 1 time each. And so, for example, like, let's look at some of the discrepancies that are in the Gospels. And I leaned on Zandervan Academic for some of this material. So thank you out there, Zondervan. I don't know if that's a person or a place or just an idea, but Zondervan Academic. So for example, at the foot of the cross, right, this is a pretty important moment in the whole story. Both Matthew and Mark quote the centurion as saying, surely this man was the Son of God. That's Matthew 27:54 and Mark 15:39. But if you look at the same scene, the exact same scene, this is Luke 23:47. He actually has the centurion as saying, surely this was a righteous man. Now let's stop right there, right? If I'm a non-believer, I'm like, there you go, there you have it. How can I trust these, right? There's a big, big difference between being the Son of God and a righteous man. It's a big, big difference. There's a decent little gap between those 2 labels. I agree. I completely agree. Well, what's interesting about these discrepancies is, I think, to better understand the discrepancies, and this is where I really leaned on Zondervan for the help. The gospel writers, each gospel writer, right, they had different backgrounds, they had different perspectives, obviously, and they were unique individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, through their presentations and their documentation to the specific audiences that they were speaking to, they each kind of had different goals. They each kind of had a different just way about how they recorded the Gospels. Like Zondervan helped me out with this. Matthew, they kind of focus on the gospel of Jesus being the Messiah, and it is the most structured of all the Gospels. Mark, they kind of focus on, he kind of focuses on the gospel of the suffering Son of God, and his gospel is the most dramatic, a lot of people feel. Luke focuses on the gospel of the Savior for all people, so his is going to be the most thematic, not that those are necessarily cause and effect. And then John, the gospel of the divine Son who reveals the Father, and John's gospel has been considered the most theological. Now, all of those, they're very close, right? They're obviously very, very close. They're all describing the same person, the same life, death, resurrection of the man Jesus Christ. But they're all a little bit different, right? It's kind of like, if you're like any kind of writer, if you're trying to achieve a certain objective, right? If you're trying to write in a certain style, like it's gonna fit that theme. So the words that you might choose and the labels that you might apply are going to be a little bit different. And so the fact that the centurion said the Son of God in one and the centurion said a righteous man in the other, does that really undermine the credibility of the Gospels? Man, I don't know. I don't think so. Now, some of you out there might still be sticklers and you're like, I kind of think it does. And you know what? Maybe you need more than this. And I respect that. But to me, I'm like, I don't know, man. I'm just not sure. I mean, here's a couple more examples. And so if we go down to... what about when one gospel mentions two individuals while another speaks only of one, right? This is another one this is a very, very common criticism of the Gospels. Like you have, two demon-possessed men in Matthew 8:28 versus one demon-possessed man in Mark 5:2. Two blind men, Matthew 20:30. One blind man, Mark 10:46. Two angels at the tomb. Again, pretty important moment. Luke 24:4, one angel at the tomb, Mark 16:5. So it appears that Mark is the fly in the ointment. It appears that Mark is the one that's jamming us up because he keeps reporting one person when everyone else reports two. And so what's interesting about this, though, is let's think about this a little bit. Like let's apply some logic and some reasoning. Does Mark ever say that there's only one person? He actually doesn't. Right? He actually does. He just says, there's a blind man, in this spot. There's an angel at the tomb. He doesn't say that he or she was the only person or only angel at the tomb. Maybe Mark is just trying to highlight the main player in that little snippet of the story that he is trying to record. Maybe not, right? Maybe not at all. But I'm just saying, like, maybe he's just recording the one person that he feels is the most prominent in that storyline. That's certainly possible, and that's certainly, plausible. And so when it comes to these discrepancies, when it comes to, these recorded accounts that serve as proof of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, according to their veracity, I don't know that these little discrepancies should be enough to dissuade someone from further examination, right? From looking at it a little bit more deeply, from trying to make up their minds, a little bit more fully, from trying to reckon with that claim, right? If anything, I think they're signs of authenticity. If anything, I think they are layers of reliability in these accounts. Because it's very clear that the gospel writers, they didn't get together to make sure all their stories were free of conflict, right? They didn't all come together and have meetings and say, all right, listen, I'm going to record this in this way. You do the same thing. Make sure we don't mess up. Make sure we have the same lines. Make sure we use the same words, same adjectives, same superlatives. Like, let's do all this stuff, right? They didn't do that. What did they do? They just recorded what they saw. They just recorded what they heard. And that's going to lead to, a little bit of conflict in terms of, all right, there's one angel, there's two angels, there's one blind man, there's two blind men, right? Righteous man, son of God, right? Things like that. And it's like, all right, there's going to be these little kind of jagged edges around, the periphery of the story. But if anything, that speaks to their authenticity more than their, unreliability. If anything, that makes them more valid, not less valid. Because these are 4 unique perspectives of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus. Now, again, you've still got to reckon with the claim, right? That was not really the purpose of this podcast. I do that plenty in all the other podcast episodes that we do inside the Faith F. But I don't know, man. I think it's pretty interesting. When you think about the timing, right, for all the reasons we went through, and then you think about the eyewitness nature of these accounts and the little discrepancies. Like, let's not shy away from the discrepancies. Let's welcome them. Let's welcome them as proof that these are authentic. Let's welcome them as proof that these are indeed accurate recordings of what these 4 individuals saw. I don't know, man. You take all those things together, at least those 2 things together, you got a pretty strong case for the Gospels. All right, man. So that is it for today's podcast. Man, you guys know I appreciate you guys, right? You guys know I appreciate you guys so much. Like, you have so many different options to spend your time in terms of what you watch, what you listen to, the content that you consume. And so the fact that you've taken, 20, 30 minutes today to listen to this podcast, I am just beyond grateful. I'm humbled. I'm very honored that you chose to spend your time with me. If you want to bounce on down into the description and check out some other content, other things on the YouTube channel, if you're on the YouTube channel, or head on over to the YouTube channel if you're somewhere else. Check out the other episodes in the podcast and lots of content, in the 3 F's, fitness, finance, and faith. And that's it, man. I will see you guys next time.